Asset creation and acquisition is very much around how we establish capability. Now, asset creation, it could be a physical asset, a non-physical asset. And the acquisition part, or acquire, is do we buy it, do we build it, or do we actually develop it up through the organisation in its own right? So we need to define what are the requirements and specifications before we even set out to obtain that capability or that asset. We need to manage the planning, design, installation, commissioning, handover, and even the whole of life considerations, at least for standing up that asset initially. The whole of life cost, risk and performance maintainability on the onset, capturing and transferring accurate as-built information into the asset information system. So that very much comes back to section 5.5 configuration management. And then, of course, ensuring that the acquisitions along with the organization's strategic and operational needs is in parallel. It works together. But this is a really important step for any organization because it's usually wound up in capital investment of some type, and you want to make sure your purchase, your acquisition is fit for purpose. All organizations struggle with clarity of requirements. There is a real risk that requirements aren't defined, aren't understood, sometimes brushed over, rushed through, which leads to, of course, the wrong assets being procured, being acquired, which therefore impairs our ability to deliver products and services to our stakeholders. The way around this, of course, is to engage stakeholders early, ask them what good looks like, and consider it across the life perspective, and then validate those requirements as you do. One tension I see between many organizations, whether they're internal supplying of assets or external, is this whole integration or handover, as we call it. A lot of friction, a lot of conflict. People won't sign off if things are ill-defined. But if you've got a requirement out there or a set of requirements, you should be able to measure your as-built information. Is it missing? Is it impaired? Is it incomplete? And most importantly, it's not translated or transferred into operations. They're the ones that have to actually manage and use this asset over its life. So we can build in those handover requirements into contracts, monitor compliance to that. But as we said earlier on in asset information standards, you don't want to over-specify to drive behavior. All you're really seeking is what is the information and data required that enable me to accept that asset and take it into operations. When introducing a new asset, we need to make sure that all stakeholders have been involved from the beginning. We just talked about a systems engineering approach. Well, we need to make sure that all functions, whether it's engineering, maintenance, supply chain, HR, commercial, are involved up the front. We need to make sure when we're talking about being involved with the design, we're not just talking about the design of the physical asset, we're talking about the design of the solution, of the outcome. So a way around all through this is to establish multidisciplinary project teams. They can ensure alignment and also verify and validate as you go through the process to accept the asset being handed over from a progressive assurance perspective. When introducing a new asset, it might be a like-for-like replacement, then that's not so bad. But if we're introducing a new asset that is more technically advanced, looks different, behaves differently to what we had before, change resistance can be a real force that we need to understand, unpack, and reckon with. So one way we can do that is, of course, letting people know that the asset will be coming, whatever that is, provide training, maybe demonstrations, simulations, but also involve end users in the commissioning. Because a couple of things can be important there. Maybe if it's only supply chain or engineering doing your commissioning, you're only looking through one perspective. But if you invite operations, HR, and do a more holistic handover, chances are you'll get the right outcome and hold people to account in the process. In finance and asset management, we often refer to value of an asset, value from an asset. There's another saying, if you don't pay now, you'll pay later. So the real risk here is around short-termism. It's only what we want to spend It's the capital spend, and therefore that's it, that's the budget. But if we're only looking at a short horizon and not the overarching way in which the asset supports service delivery or product delivery, we're cutting ourselves off out of spite. What we need to do is communicate what the whole of life cost is, what are the benefits, and how do we factor that into decision making. This comes back to inviting the right stakeholders to the beginning of the acquisition so that they can have a say in what are they prepared for. Because finance is only one input. There's morale, there's intellectual property, there are commercials, there's a lot goes into this. So cost versus value needs to be unpacked earlier on in the process, not debated when the asset's being handed over. Just as we would as consumers really want to understand to what standard something's being delivered, we can only achieve that really when we've got supplier and contract alignment. There is a true risk here that external suppliers deliver an asset that might be substandard, doesn't meet our standards, might not be fit for purpose in any dimension. So we need to make sure that we embed standards and we understand what standards they actually are. We look at the compliance and the performance requirements in procurement. The other thing we need to make sure is when we're thinking about procurement is we're setting them up for success. We're not just waiting to the last minute and saying, go and order this. There is a life cycle in procurement, strategic sourcing, going out through an expression of interest all the way down through to receipting and actually sharing that material or spare parts with operations. But again, we need to make sure that we understand what we require, the compliance and the standard by which that's undertaken, and make sure that's translated through to our suppliers and contractors to gain that alignment. From an ISO 55001 perspective, the key alignment areas are Section 8.1, operational planning and control, including life cycle management. When we were going through the international standard, we made a point of drawing out the life cycle management. It seemed to be implied or absent, and that really is the key when you're thinking about acquisition, to not just look at the initial purchase, but look at the whole of life. And Section 8.2, control of change. If you're introducing a new asset, a like-for-like asset, or you're having to replace an asset with something that's modified to what you had before, the control of change is super important, as is configuration management. So in summary, asset creation and acquisition ensures new assets are delivered right the first time and add value throughout their life cycle. And as you start to become comfortable with asset management, you'll become comfortable with the fact that an asset can be physical or non-physical, and as such, the combination of all your assets actually becomes the capability of your organization.